They moved to Britain more than half a century ago, but now some members of the so-called Windrush generation are facing possible deportation. But why? With the government apologising and promising an investigation, will that be enough? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. Today with me, Peter Dobbie. Now, they are called the Windrush generation. That's a reference to a ship, the Empire Windrush, that carried the first wave of immigrants from the West Indies to the UK in 1948. Many arrived as children on their parents' passports, and they've lived in the UK for more than 70 years, paying taxes and insurance, but they've never formally become British citizens. Now, as the government tightens its immigration rules, those without the proper documentation are being denied services, and they are even facing deportation. Some are calling it cruel and inhumane treatment. We have a lot to get to grips with here on the programme today. First, this report from Barnaby Phillips from London.
He came to Britain from Barbados when he was 9 years old, more than 50 years ago. His father had a job in the post office. Michael married in Britain, had children, grandchildren, worked in education, thought he was British, until the government told him he didn't have the right documents. He lost his job as he fought for the right to stay here.
If I was deported, I didn't know what I would do. To take someone out and just throw them out, like if they had no worth, because that is what they're doing, you know? It's about worth, what you've produced and what you've done to help Britain be the better place than it was.
This is the arrival of more than 400 happy Jamaicans.
The so-called Windrush generation, named after a ship that carried the first arrivals from the Caribbean in 1948. Invited to Britain, given citizenship. It's many of the children who travelled with their parents who are now facing difficulties. Some have been caught out by strict new laws specifying documents they need to prove how long they've been here.
This row could not have blown up at a more embarrassing time for the British government, the very week in which it hosts the Commonwealth Summit, in which it's busy emphasising its friendship with former colonies as it prepares to leave the EU.
Ministers told Parliament they're trying to repair the damage with a special team to help the Windrush generation, a promise to resolve their cases quickly, free of charge, although the government isn't sure whether some people have already been deported in error.
Can she tell the House how many have been detained as prisoners in their own country? Can she tell the House how many have been denied health under the National Health Service? How many have denied pensions? How many have lost their job? This is a day of national shame.
Mr. Speaker, I share the Honourable Gentleman's admiration for the people who came here from the Caribbean and contributed so much to our society in many, many different ways, and that admiration remains in place. I am concerned that the Home Office has become too concerned with policy and strategy and sometimes lose sight of the individual.
But who was in charge of the Home Office when these new, stricter policies were being designed? Yes, today's Prime Minister, Theresa May. So, as the public outcry grows, there's now a political as well as moral imperative to treat the Windrush generation fairly. Barnaby Phillips, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, the British Prime Minister Theresa May, who we saw in Barnaby's package there today, apologised to several Caribbean leaders over this Windrush controversy. The leaders are in London, as we've been hearing, for CHOGM. That's the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. Now, here's a little taste of what Mrs May said today.
I take this issue very seriously. The Home Secretary apologised to the House of Commons yesterday for any anxiety caused, and I want to apologise to you today.
OK, there we are. Here we go. Let's get the thoughts of our guests today here on Inside Story. Joining us from London is Daghlian, CEO of Praxis. Now, that's an organisation that provides assistance to people affected by the Windrush controversy. Joining us from Nottingham is Clive Foster, a member of the Nottingham Citizens Group. Welcome to you both. Clive, can you just walk us through what your family's experience of this was?
Well, I'm also a pastor of a local church in Nottingham. And just this past Sunday, we spoke to our congregation with regards to what is happening, that potentially people from the Caribbean who have been in this country for over 30, 40, 50 years potentially could be deported. I'm sad to say that there was real outrage, disbelief of this injustice. I did have members of our congregation coming up to me, and other ministers in the church were receiving people who were very concerned about this. And it was obviously in the news, and we have a situation where people who, my own family, my own father and mother, they came from Jamaica. They came because they were invited. They came and my mother, she worked in the NHS and came and built up the NHS after World War II. My father worked in the factories. And to think that they came over, and I was born in this country, but my other brothers came over as siblings. And then having them working for so many years to know that their own legitimate citizens potentially were being told that they could be deported. It was very, very concerning and very heartbreaking. And I must say, there are a number of people who were still very concerned about their own situation.
There has been this apology from Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, formerly the Home Secretary, because the rules were tightened when she was at the Home Office back in 2012. For you and the people you've been talking to, is an apology and a task force being set up to counter this? Is that enough?
I do welcome the Prime Minister's apology. I have to say, obviously, it did require pressure from ordinary people, pressure from certain MPs. Very disappointed that we weren't seeing so many MPs actually coming out, because, as I mentioned, in our own local church, we've been battling with this for years, and we've gone to our MPs, and then they have been put back because they say, well, the Home Office has said such and such, and as a result, they don't persist with it. So something that we are very concerned about. Great that they've set up a task force. Great that we have an apology. But these are people's lives who have been affected. They have lost their jobs, they've lost their income, they've lost their dignity. And I think we really need to be looking into that in terms of compensation and the respect that should be afforded to them.
Sally Daghlian in London, why are we only finding out about this now? Because if you've got people who are in their 40s, their 50s, I guess also their 60s, if this is presenting itself because they don't have the right paperwork, why has it taken so long for that to happen?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. We've been working for people over the last 3 years or so now who've been having these difficulties. More and more people are emerging in these situations because different changes are coming in that the Home Office or the government has introduced. For example, that people are expected to provide documentation before they can access health care, that there are new landlord checks to make sure that people have got the right to rent a property. These people came when these sorts of checks weren't in place. They didn't have the kind of paperwork that's now being required. In fact, the government introduced a requirement to have these biometric residence permits. And it's been incredibly difficult for people to get them, and often because they don't have the original documents they arrived on. What's happened in effect is that the world has changed around these residents, and what's required now is totally different from what was required when they arrived. And when they try and sort out this matter with the Home Office, it's really complicated. The Home Office starts from a position of not believing. So there's this culture of disbelief. People are treated with a lack of respect, they're treated with disdain, and they're required to provide evidence that, frankly, in some cases doesn't exist or is just excessive. So no less than one piece of official documentary evidence for every year that someone's been in the UK. But preferably 4 pieces of documentary evidence. So the task of trying to actually research and gather that information to prove to the Home Office that you have status. And actually what's happening is that people have been falling individually into this great black hole. So as a charity, we've been supporting people who have become street homeless, people who have been refused health care or who have been given health care and then given a very large bill. And the fact that they can't pay the bill then goes on to their immigration record. So people have had doors closed in their face. Trying to sort it out is really difficult. You need legal help. And there's no legal aid available. So if people can't pay for a lawyer, then they're really stuck.
Clive,
and even
just to put that point, Sally, back to Clive for a second, if I could just interrupt you. Clive, is that a story you're hearing, that people have got to go back and the onus is on them to prove their Britishness? I mean, to talk about age again, if you're in your 40s or your 50s, you know, who has the paperwork going back to doing your 11 plus in the UK when you were 11 years old? Few of us have that anyway.
And that is what is most concerning about this, is that the burden of proof is on the individual to prove their Britishness. Well, look, they are legitimate British citizens and they had the right to remain. And what is very concerning is that we're finding that people, they are now very concerned about their elderly relatives. This goes wider than what's being even reported in the media. And I have to say as well that this is not just affecting, and I really want to make this point, this is not just affecting people who are threatened with deportation because they're at the age of 30, 40, 50 or whatever. It's very senior people, but what I'm very concerned about is the dynamics that it's causing between the generations as well. We have younger people now who hear, see, and they know that potentially their grandparents, parents could be deported. And it's creating an uneasiness. It's creating a breakdown in a trust as well. So I think there is wider implications with this. Yes, we need to focus on the people who are going to be immediately affected. But even as a church, we're having to pick up the emotional damage that this is doing for people in this country, younger families as well who are affected by it, as well as people abroad. Some of these people being threatened that they've never been back to the country for years, and they are British citizens, they've come, they've worked, they've laboured, they've paid into the taxes, they've paid their national insurance, and then there's this indignity to say that you may be threatened to be deported. Very concerned that the threshold level, as our colleague has mentioned, is the burden is back on them. And more needs to be done with the government. And I really want to see that we can get some legitimacy in terms of that the burden of proof is not with them, and that this task force would be looking at this area.
And Sally, also to pick up on that point that Clive's making there, I mean, people were handed a pamphlet saying, try to be Jamaican. I mean, that's like saying, try to be Martian, try to be French, try to be Canadian, because you're saying to British people, oh, just stick a pin in the globe and try and be that person from that country when you've never been there.
The whole thing is incredulous, and you know, the Home Office and the government can't say that they weren't aware that this was going to happen, because many organisations have been warning for years that the introduction of this so-called hostile environment would lead to this situation, that people are being requested to provide evidence that they don't have, which never existed. I know there is an obligation on the government under human rights legislation and under equalities legislation that when it introduces a policy, it should look at whether it's going to differentially affect a particular group of people, and to then make arrangements to make sure that people are not disadvantaged. It's only this week that the government has been shamed into admitting that it has done something wrong. And I think the Prime Minister has publicly apologised today for anxiety caused. Well, let's say this goes a lot further than anxiety. This is about taking away people's homes, about leaving people homeless and on the streets, literally eating out of bins in some cases, and who've been unable to find any redress. And actually getting in touch with the Home Office to try and sort things out, as we've heard a number of politicians and ministers say, just get in touch with the Home Office. It's almost impossible to get through on the telephone. You can make a request to the Home Office to see your file and to know whether the Home Office has in fact recorded your leave to remain. It will take generally a minimum of 6 months to get any sort of response from the Home Office. So meanwhile, people are left in these really difficult situations. So I think it's not just about this Windrush generation, it's about some broader issues about the way the Home Office works and this creation of a climate of fear and a culture of disbelief.
Okay, picking up, Clive, on that point of broader changes, if you have ever examined, if one has ever examined how, say, the Metropolitan Police Force, the London Police Force, go into areas of race or racial tension, I guess their starting point for that would be, the Brixton riots in 1981. We got the Scarman report off the back of that. But between 1981, going back the way, there were 2 generations of the Windrush adults, the Windrush children, that had arrived in a very different London, a very different UK, not least because of, say, the police force attitude towards immigrants in the UK, because after World War II, surely you had, the police force was run by old white senior guys who hadn't gone to war, literally, or young white junior guys who had gone to war but brought back certain attitudes with them. So the attitudes, do they still have to change?
A lot of work has to be done to ensure that there is equality, there is justice, and there is fairness, particularly from Black and Asian people, particularly from people who are Commonwealth citizens, who are citizens of this country. I go back to my own mother and father, were invited to come over to the country. They laboured legitimately, they worked in the NHS, in the factories, on the transport services, and then finding now that they are threatened, not them in particular, but we're in a situation today that they are potentially threatened with deportation from the Caribbean legitimate. It's really, really unhelpful. And I want to pick up on the point that our colleague made in terms of some of the anxieties. I mean, we've got people who are, I know that we've dealt with in our own church, young people who have been sent to detention centres, and people existing in this, who are caught in this loop, they've been threatened with. Some of them have been to detention centres. Such is the indignity of this in the way that they've been treated. Now, you talk about the police, and I want to frame it in an overall, we have to look at the overall dignity and respect that should be afforded to communities, particularly from, I'm speaking now from the Black community who have come over and laboured and are entitled as citizens to be present here and shouldn't be treated any differently from anybody else.
Sally, on that idea of, let's just put that idea to Sally Daghlian, Clive. Sally, on that idea of dignity and respect, 1953, 1955, 1957, consecutive British Home Secretaries commissioned big reports. And they all kind of said the same thing, which was this. They said, we cannot tell whether ethnic minorities in the UK are not integrating because they choose not to or because they're not being allowed to. So if compassion within a migration policy is a prerequisite, how do you codify that? How do you make sure it actually happens?
I think, compassion, humanity and respect have to be there in any policy. That doesn't mean that you can't make decisions about a government, as a government, about who should or shouldn't be allowed to enter the country. The problem we have now is that the system starts by assuming that everyone is out to abuse the system, and there's been no flexibility, no regard for individual circumstances. There's been no humanity in it. And this has been raised on numerous occasions, and most recently, I think, by the Law Society of England, who commented on the fact that 50% of Home Office immigration appeals are upheld. And in many cases, it's because the Home Office has acted unlawfully and is very, very reluctant to actually admit that it's made mistakes. And people are forced through the court system. And now that's if they can afford legal support and legal representation. So I think there are lots of ideas and ways of doing it. It's about, there are issues about, excuse me, policy, process, training, But at the bottom, at the root of it all, there is something about attitude. And the leadership hasn't been there in terms of saying we want to have a fair system. Instead, the leadership has been sending out vehicles to go around the streets of London, threatening that people will be deported. We currently have a detention system that is absolutely scandalous. We can detain people in immigration sentences without limit. For people who are detained, they say it's worse than prison. At least any prisoner, anyone who has committed any crime, knows how long they will be held in custody. In the UK detention system, there is no time limit, there is no automatic judicial oversight, and people are literally abandoned.
Clive, if we just fast forward for a second to where we are today, so many cities and towns in the UK are multicultural, they are multi-ethnic, and everyone has the right paperwork. I mean, there are, 230 languages in London, 240 nationalities. But do you get the feeling that perhaps the West Indian community back in the 50s, back in the 60s, behaved with a sense of deference to the system, to the police, to the Home Office, so they maybe didn't shout about this when their critics might say they should have?
Well, they believed and had the full assurances that they were British citizens. They came over here in that good faith, worked in that good faith, brought up their families in good faith, were active and good citizens in good faith, and would have expected so much more than what we're actually seeing played out today. If this was to be told, you couldn't believe it. I have to say that what we are finding in our communities is that people are much more, even more aware of the importance now of engaging in civil society and actually understanding that they have rights as well. And with these rights, like appealing to our local authority, appealing to our local councils, appealing to our MPs. As I mentioned earlier, in our own church, we've had members who have been subject to these really kind of draconian Home Office laws. And as a result of that, we've had to lobby MPs. We've had to lobby the authorities to get justice. And I think what we are beginning to see now, and unfortunately, it's reached a situation that we have today, whereby legitimate British citizens from the Caribbean have been threatened with deportation, that there is a more of a widespread now acceptance and recognition that unless we come together and act and work together for justice, we could very easily be slipping into a situation where injustices are being done to the black community. That's why it's important that we have so many activities that are happening that promote equality, fairness and justice. And that's why it's important that the black community continue to engage with the authorities to make sure that if they are facing these situations, they are challenged and that something is done about it. And I'm hoping that the task force will really alleviate some of the fears and apprehensions that still exist around this issue.
Last word to you, Sally, in our last 60 seconds or so. I noticed the Number 10 website's got a petition now talking about an amnesty. 135,000 people have signed that. That means, in theory, there will be a debate in the House of Commons. Do you get the feeling that putting that together with the apology from the Prime Minister, she used to be the Home Secretary, this is arguably her handiwork, her responsibility, that we might be heading towards a better implementation of immigration policy as opposed to the actual statutes that immigration policy operates within?
I think it's really important that we use this as a turning point to look at the immigration system overall. At the moment, Caribbean residents are in the spotlight, but other people are also suffering. Other people are being denied treatment to which they're entitled, or having their residence questioned. And so I think what's really important now is the detail of what comes. I think it's very easy for the government to talk about, fairness and it's setting up a task force. But let's look at the reality. Let's look at the system that's going to be proposed. Let's look at making sure that we enable individuals to have access to legal advice to support them through this system. Let's make sure that the government actually takes on the responsibility for helping people in this situation to have the right documentation, and that it really does shift the burden of proof from the individual who has done no wrong.
Okay.
We don't need to talk about amnesties because people haven't done anything wrong.
Okay, we will have to leave it there. Thank you to both our guests today, Sally Daghlian and Clive Foster, and thank you to you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com, and do check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, AJ Inside Story, or at Peter Dobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.